Okay. Oh shoot. Is like my mic correct? Is my camera correct? Yes. Hi everyone. Always getting this wrong. Even though we've been doing this for like 2 years, 2.5 years. This is Melanie, Melanie Yazzie, co-host of Red Power Hour. I am joined by my other co-host, Elena Ortiz. Would you like to say hello?
Hello, I am calling in from Ogapoge, otherwise known as Santa Fe or Mordor, where it's kind of overcast and gloomy, which I normally like, except I'd rather be taking a nap.
True words. I would rather be taking a nap than recording what we have to talk about right now. Yeah, not looking forward to it. Kiley. Speaking of Kiley, we're joined by our comrade Kiley, who has been on Red Power Hour several times, but is back for this special review episode. You want to say hi, Kiley?
Ja, het is Kylie here. And yeah, I'm super excited to get into this conversation today.
That was so convincing.
The funny thing is that we all saw this movie, and like I didn't think anything of it. Then I got home and I was like really grossed out and really depressed and like unhappy. And I texted Melanie and I said, "Yeah, I just saw Wakanda Forever. Ouch. Like, ouch was what I said." And then she texted me back. She said, "Yeah, we saw it." And like it started this whole conversation about, and Kiley saw it. And we had like this whole thing. So many Red Nation comrades saw this movie and were like so disturbed by it. And we just decided we had to do a podcast, but it was almost like a hive mind response. Everybody was like, gross. So we have to talk about it. We have to take it apart. We have to deconstruct, and we have to analyze, and we're doing it all for you. Falling on the sword about this movie.
For the people.
For the people, for the listeners. We're so grateful that you are here, and we hope
we really are.
This will shed some light on how we all felt about this film, because I haven't seen anything from an Indigenous perspective. And there's been a lot of positive reviews, which I just shake my head.
It's made over $1.3 billion.
Yep.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. I'm assuming that's globally. Again, real quick, we're talking about the second Black Panther movie that came out like 2 weeks ago-ish, little over 2 weeks ago, Wakanda Forever. It cost $250 million to make, so $250 million, and then it has grossed, as of now, $1.344 billion, which matters. I think it matters in terms of the sheer number of people who are watching and consuming the political message of the movie. We're going to concentrate today on the political message of the movie. We all found it deeply disturbing, profoundly anti-Indian, and I'll describe why I think it's anti-Indian and not anti-Indigenous actually later on. But it's profoundly anti-Indian, and it's pretty much like the most anti-liberation kind of approach to politics I've seen in a long time. And I understand that as maybe it's like a bit unfair to put like a different standard, on this movie, but I think it's just because the politics of the first Black Panther were really celebrated, and for really good reason, I think. Just like the beauty of a kind of African and Indigenous nationalism or nationhood that was allowed to develop, in the absence of colonialism, where like intelligence and innovation and ingenuity are celebrated, right? Because there's such like racist stereotypes in, popular culture about Black and Indigenous folks specifically, right, as not having those things, or like not having the capacity or the faculties that usually like white protagonists get to have in these types of movies. And so
And
the
community too.
and the
Like
community, the strength, I don't know.
the different tribes or clans that made
Yeah.
up Wakanda in the first one, and the community, how they felt about each other and celebrated each other was really uplifting, and we don't get that here.
Yeah. And so I think, so I guess what I'm trying to say is really quick, and then y'all can just jump in because we have so much to say. Um, in comparison to the first movie, that I think politically was incredibly empowering, because like any movie that's about futurism, and so Black Panther, the first movie, was definitely an Afrofuturist vision of what Black liberation, or like what is possible in a world where oppression and like white supremacy and colonialism doesn't dominate every horizon of your existence. And so that was really beautiful, right? To be able to see a world that was created, not really a kind of a utopia, but nevertheless it allows you to like imagine what liberation or like what life might be like in the absence of this incredible structural violence we've experienced over the last 500 years, but then also what the future might look like, right? It was a very affirming, a very empowering, I think, movie about a lot of different things. And Wakanda Forever was the exact opposite of that. And in fact, I think it's just like and is profoundly counter revolutionary. And so it just felt like a punch in the gut, I think, for that reason, because the first one provided a politics of futurity and life and affirmation, whereas the second one was pretty much the opposite of that. But we'll go into it. I really hated it. My review, I really, really did not like this movie. Maybe we can talk here at the beginning of like how we felt watching the movie. Like Elena, you were saying that it wasn't until you went home that you felt the ouch moment. You know, whenever I'm like out in the world and I experience an act of racism, for example, I usually like disassociate, or I kind of like I'm in shock after it happens, and it's not usually till the end of that day or the next day that it really like sets in what happened, and then it just kind of like ruins my day. Sometimes it ruins my week. You know, like when the shock wears off or whatever, or the adrenaline wears off from those moments. That's pretty much how I felt during this film. I disassociated for a lot of it, especially once the indigenous characters appeared, because it was super racist in the way it was portraying native, or not native, well, yes, native people, but indigenous people more broadly. Um, and then I left the theater kind of numb, and it wasn't until a little while later that I got really angry, actually. But Kylie, you want to talk a little bit about your experience as an indigenous person watching this film?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay. So this may be a little long-winded, but so in my conversations with other comrades about this movie, I was like pointing out, the release date of this movie was like during a very like contentious or like tumultuous time for indigenous people, cuz like that week or that Monday, November 9th, was when we first started hearing the oral arguments of like Supreme Court judges for ICWA, and that was live streamed. And so I had listened to that prior, and then also too just like so with that conversation, it sparked within like indigenous communities what like sovereignty means to us, but also how like helped us to realize that like our sovereignty is actually very fragile. Because with if ICWA is like taken away, then everything else is like in jeopardy. So land, water, like nationhood, everything. So that was sort of on my mind before I had watched this movie. And then we had organizers who were gearing up for the Leonard Peltier March in DC that same week. And then earlier in the year, you know, we had been thinking about like water. So there was the water crisis in Mississippi, in Mississippi, and then also too there was like a lot of support and just a lot of like awareness um in Oahu and their water systems, and how the Navy, has been poisoning like their aquifer and their water for decades. So I think just in general, people have been developing this sort of like consciousness and have been thinking about like where we are like realistically in terms of like the climate crisis, water, our water systems, and yeah. So all of those things were just kind of on my mind, and I had decided to go to the movies because movies for me are an escape. They're kind of just a way for me to like turn off my mind for a little bit. So I went, and it was just, again, like I had to like sit through this movie and sort of like unpack everything that I had already been unpacking. Um and then like it just, like you said, it was just like a punch in the gut. It was very heartbreaking to have to receive that sort of messaging in our current like political landscape. And it's like I don't know how, I don't have the right words to describe like how disturbing it is. And then just knowing how much money it made and thinking about how many people saw that movie is just so like heartbreaking, especially if they were an audience member who were making the same connections that I did. It's just very it doesn't put you in like a positive place. It doesn't um it sort of like shuts down any sort of like like yeah, in any sort of like imaginative or like um hopeful, what's the word? Um or I guess maybe any sort of hope that you have for the future, cuz in the first one it does leave you sort of like you're open to imagine what like a liberative future would look like, or like what like international like collaborations would look like, so it kind of just leaves you free. um but with this one I felt very contained, or like I felt very imprisoned, I guess, which is exactly how I feel out in the real world. Is like, oh my god, like I'm not allowed to be me, which is like an indigenous person. I'm not allowed to exist like freely as an indigenous person. So that's kind of how I felt leaving the movie, and I was just like, what the hell just happened? Like I yeah, I kind of was just like in sort of like a whirlpool of confusion, of anger, of being like like I don't know, I felt like I had to choose a side, and I didn't like that feeling at all, because like during the movie too, I was just like actively trying to like reject any any sort of like imperialist propaganda or like American propaganda. And so I think that kind of just put me in this weird like um position or confusion of just like also having to identify and just figure out like what the hell. Like that's all. Yeah. um but I was just like in this whirlpool like for a long time after the movie. And then and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, we'll unpack things a little bit more, but it wasn't actually until after like a few days where I was just had to like clear my mind, or like come to some sort of clarity and like analysis of the movie, which I'm comfortable now, like, okay, I know what this movie was about. uh, but yeah.
Yep. Yes, all those things, like feeling yeah, Elena, you had texted me ouch, and it felt like a punch in the gut. it also kind of felt like a knife in the heart, I guess, to me, more than a punch in the gut. Um, I almost had like a feeling of betrayal or something. Uh, so I was in shock at first and then confused. I think that's a good word to describe it, confused. And then kind of a feeling of betrayal, just because I don't follow the Marvel universe. I So I don't really know about the introduction of the indigenous water nation, the Mayan water nation, in Wakanda Forever, and like where that comes and the kind of the history of the Marvel universe. I don't care. I don't care because the way that it was introduced and then portrayed in the movie was really, it didn't make any sense. Like I just didn't understand why those characters were there and like what purpose it served. You get what I'm saying? Even like narratively, not even politically. And then as soon as you find out that there's going to be this indigenous nation, from originally from the Yucatan, they're Mayan. Then they go underwater and they're like a Mayan Atlantis kind of nation. They've been driven underground essentially because of colonialism, like the really violent kind of colonialism that the Spanish brought to Latin America. And so then I think as soon as they were introduced, and then maybe just a few minutes in, my stomach just dropped as soon as the indigenous characters were introduced, and I was like, please don't let this be what I think it's going to be. And then it was. And then it just went downhill from there. And from that point forward, I was literally like bracing myself in my seat. And I was just like, my teeth, my jaw was tight. And I was just watching all of this unfold and just watching like these Black women protagonists of like Wakanda fighting this like indigenous nation that has had to go underground because of colonialism. And I'm like, why are these people fighting each other? And like, why are indigenous people being portrayed as these like irrational, like hyper radical separatists, I guess, in a way, who just want to like destroy the world? And in comparison to like Wakanda, which is, friendly to imperialism and colonialism, and is like seen and kind of cast as like the positive, like the good Indian kind of interpretation of what an anti-colonial or like a type of nationhood that can develop, a different type of nationhood developed in the context of pervasive imperialism and colonialism. And I don't know, even like the way that the indigenous people, the protagonist, his name is No Amor, which means no love. Like even like who he is as like a hero or like a demigod. It felt like a mockery or a caricature. Like he has these really dumb wings on his ankles, and he has like pointed ears like an elf or something. And again, maybe this was written into the Marvel universe, but it was like he was supposed to be this like very powerful indigenous leader of this underwater water nation, in Mayan indigenous water nation. But it was also just kind of like unbelievable. And so then the entire movie from that point forward was just like kind of this incoherent series of like acts and counteracts between these protagonists, these Black and indigenous protagonists. And it just didn't like, it just seemed unbelievable. And so I was like, why is this the story of this movie? Like, it felt like very disempowering for like all of the characters in the movie. It felt like they were all being portrayed as if they were acting out of revenge and spite and just emotion and grief. And I'm like, that is not what indigenous and Black liberation is about. Yeah, grief, sure, like, obviously like the violence of imperialism and colonialism has caused incredible trauma, for our peoples intergenerationally. But like liberation is about strength, right? It's about like loving who you are and acting out of that place of strength. It's like the affirmation that your people will have a future. And instead, what this movie was a bunch of like liberal individuals who were just like fighting with each other online. That's just kind of how the movie felt, and I really hated it because it reduced the beautiful, like incredible, hard-won struggles that our peoples have undertaken historically and right now. It just basically reduced them to like liberal infighting or like the tokenizing gesture of identity politics. And that was like probably the most insulting thing to me in the movie. That and then like just like the weird caricature of indigenous people and I don't know. Yeah.
The caricature of Namor and actually all of Talokan, which is the underwater city, and the people were it was incoherent. You didn't know what they were trying to portray. You kind of figured out that it was, an indigenous sort of pseudo Mayan kind of thing, but it was so incoherent that it was frustrating to watch them, and then to like the first, well, there's a lot of thoughts that went through my head, but the first one I think was, wait, are these people going to fight each other? Are they going to be enemies like the Wakandans and the Talakans? So what, like, why are the brown people fighting the black people? Like, that was the first major kind of like head snap that I had while watching it. And then I settled in to realize I'm going to hate this movie, so I'm just going to try to like take in what I can and notice what I can. And the second thing after um the Talokan like being really confused about what they were was the women who um had in the first movie seemed so um I don't know a word for it, like Okoye, who is the head of the female army, and Shuri, who was like this incredibly brilliant inventor and created all of these things, um, and even Rwanda was the mom, the queen, were like very positive, very sort of uplifting characters, and in this movie they just were all like subjected to this bougie liberal like infighting, and the women fought with each other. They didn't stand up for each other. There was not, any sense of cohesiveness or community. So that was super depressing. And so there was a lot of misogyny, there was a lot of anti-Indianness, and there was a lot of anti-blackness. And it was exactly what Melanie said, like it was an anti-liberation movement. It sort of negated everything that was feel good about the first movie, and made it into this like Wakanda can only survive if they accept imperialism and accept liberalism and accept colonization, because clearly Talokan is going to be an enemy, and they need the US to help fight this enemy. And it just got so icky and so depressing. And then it just kept reinforcing that throughout the whole film with every female character. The young student who's at MIT, and she's invented all these amazing things, and yet she's making her money by selling test scores or doing tests for this white jock character. And then she becomes, they have to take her, and then she becomes this sort of fangirl for the Wakandans, which is very disturbing also. But yeah, it was just it was almost like trying to get through it, noticing as many things as I could that were awful, like a notepad in my brain going, "Oh, that's fucked up," and that's fucked up, and that's fucked. And then I got out of it. I was like, "God, that was way worse than I thought it was going to be." I mean, it started out, I was thinking this is bad, and then when I walked out, I was like, "Oh, that was even worse than I thought it was going to be." So yeah, it was super depressing.
Oh god, yeah. What I also just, oh my gosh, That's exactly it, Elena. It was literally like, yeah, like checking off all the fucked up things. Oh my god. Like, okay, so another thing that I wanted to point out too about this movie is, okay, so what I didn't like was that I kept hoping for some sort of redemption and it never came. And that was probably the most disappointing thing. Is just you're literally just in a whirlpool forever and there's just like no way of getting out of it. But also, what's like what kept sticking out to me is um sort of like the way that Americans and like the CIA are framed in this movie, which is very like friendly, very like cutesy funny. They bring like comedic relief. Um and then it's like move forward to like these indigenous nations that can't, protect themselves. They are infighting, like you said, and they can't agree on their resources. Um, yeah, which are all tropes. Like they're all yeah, but anyway, okay. So with that in mind, it's like as an audience, you're forced to choose sides. Like you're forced to choose between like the good and the bad. And somehow the Americans don't have anything to do with that. They fall into the background, and we're supposed to like refer to them as like our favorite colonizers, which I will never ever do. Like liberalism takes everything, but they're not going to take that word away from us. Like I will always identify my enemies as like the colonizers, as settlers, because in reality they're hoarding wealth, they're stealing land, they're imprisoning our people. Leonard Peltier, like the FBI, CIA, the US is responsible for the injustices of Leonard Peltier and just like, yeah. Anyway, so I just want to say that, like, do not ever like turn colonizer or settler into an affectionate term. That's never going to be a term of endearment, damn it. um, anyway, so that was also what made me so uncomfortable about this movie is that it's such a false like representation of like everybody in it, especially the Americans. Like that's so disturbing to me that they would sort of like change this narrative or like redefine like the CIA or like the US government as like this cutesy friendly entity when it's not. And in reality, like if Wakanda existed, like the US would be planning like a coup, like to take vibranium or to like um force Wakanda like into submission or like take away their sovereignty, take away their resources and their wealth. Like that, so I just like could not believe like just how much the US propaganda is in this film and the like reframing of their position as like this, I don't know, in a way it's like kind of trying to, I don't like, I guess maybe like, I don't know if disarm is the right word, or to like encourage oppressed peoples and colonized people to like let their guard down. Like, America's not that bad. Like, you know, we're not this like powerful, like global dominating country, like this death machine. We're not that. Like, look at these people, they're funny. They can have good relations with other, it's just so I can't believe I could not. That's like one thing I was not letting go of like in this movie, was just like I don't believe it for a second. Like I'm not taking this US propaganda, like, oh god, please just erase it from my memory.
Like there's like the good CIA and the bad CIA, because there's like, you know, at the beginning of the movie, Angela Bassett, who plays the Queen of Wakanda, is at the UN, and you find out there's like this scene, right, where the French have sent in a covert, their version, I'm assuming, of the CIA or whatever operation to steal vibranium from a Wakandan facility where I forgot where it was, you know, and then she like hauls all of the paramilitary dudes, the special ops, the French special ops dudes in, and she, you know, she like confronts the French president or whoever that person is representing France at the UN, and she's like, "Don't do this," you know. And so then there are parts of the CIA that are trying to get vibranium through like the sneaky US imperial maneuvers, right? The coup kind of aspects. But you have Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and then, you know, Elena, you pointed out, I don't actually remember his name. It's the British actor who plays Bilbo in The Hobbit, right? And so you have these kind of like friendly, like the friendly faces of the CIA, which actually has always bothered me about Marvel movies. That's why Iron Man is my least favorite in the entire Marvel universe, because Iron Man is played by what's his face. I was going to say Robert Redford. It's not Robert Downey Jr. It's not Robert Redford, and he's also kind of like small in stature. He's like really funny, right? He's like very likable. He's like a charismatic character. But he's just like a stan for the US Army, you know, the US military and US imperialism, and most Marvel characters are in general. And so this one is also positioning like Wakanda as making an evaluation between who's like the good CIA and the bad CIA. And these are like the good colonizers. And then you have the underwater nation Tulkins, what? Talokan. The Talokan, they're like, these motherfuckers are our enemy. Like, they are not our friends. None of them are good. You know, they will never stop coming for us. And so there is like a type of anti-colonial politics in there that does have a standard, you know, like knowing who the enemy is and being willing to act to like protect, you know, to not just protect one's nation, but protect the water and to protect the land. And not just for themselves, but for like, you know, humanity and for the sake of the planet. And so that does exist in the film, but it's portrayed as like the bad Indians. It's like the bad Indians are the ones who don't know how to make friends with the good colonizers. And that's what feels really racist about and really anti-liberation. It's like basically mocking and then, you know, speaking of liberation struggles, Black Indigenous liberation struggles historically that have been deeply and militantly, you know, anti-colonial or anti-racist or anti-capitalist or anti-imperial, and then like portraying them with derision or almost like mockery. And that's why I was bringing up like the dumb wings on Normore's legs or his ankles, and then the little wing tip ears or whatever. It almost feels like a mockery of a kind of like strong anti-colonial liberation formation. And so it's like, okay, so you're mocking liberation. You're just mocking liberation. You're mocking the gesture and the necessity of solidarity between people of the global South. We need to talk more about like that this is a very American interpretation also of like what constitutes liberation politics in the global South, which makes it a deeply imperialist movie. Just like the unconscious of the movie is deeply imperialist because it's very American exceptionalist, it's very US centric. We don't need to go into that right now, but I'm just rambling now. But I wanted to say one other thing before I pass it back to y'all that's sort of related to this. I think my initial thought in like the hours after watching the movie, while I was watching the movie, and then the days, I'm 2 weeks out from it, so I feel, I think, a little bit differently. I felt like the movie was like very purposefully either derisive or, I don't know, like I'm going to use the word mocking again, making a mockery of Indigenous nationhood or like water protectors or, you know, like what are usually construed as the more radical, like bad Indian, like militant formations of Indigenous liberation. And it felt very intentional to me. Like it was belligerent. Actually, the word I kept thinking of in my mind was like belligerent, the way that the Indigenous Water Nation was portrayed as like the bad Indians. And I still think that that's true. But now that I'm looking back, like at the film kind of globally from a larger perspective, I actually feel like the film was making a mockery and also being incredibly derisive of pretty much like all of the pillars of our contemporary liberation formations, not just for Indigenous people, but for like Black liberation too. So it's like making fun of, or kind of making it seem like an impossibility for like Black nations or African nations in Africa or like Indigenous nations in Latin America, right? The global South to even have any type of liberation without collaborating with US imperialism. So it's making it seem like anti imperialism is an impossibility. But like the people who are interested or like advocate for anti imperialism, it's like it's already a lost cause or like it's just laughable. It's kind of like the butt of a joke. And that was like deeply offensive, but it's also like making a mockery of water protectors. You had made a great commentary about this. It kind of makes a mockery of like Black feminism or like radical Black feminism. It makes a mockery of Afro and Indigenous futurisms. It makes a mockery of international solidarity. It makes a mockery of Indigenous nationhood and Indigenous nationalism. And it makes a mockery of Black liberation struggles too. And so now I'm realizing that it's not just treating like Indigenous characters this way, it's also treating like all of the characters this way. And they're not characters. It's like the movie isn't just about characters, it's like a reflection of our political present, right? And this kind of reflection of like, this is really what people think about what constitutes liberation, that is deeply disturbing to me. And it like doesn't reflect where a lot of people are at in 2022. And the fact that the three of us here like belong to the Red Nation and we're constantly struggling for Indigenous liberation and we categorically reject all of the liberal kind of like overtures in the film, which I'm sure is why it felt like we're rejecting the film as we were watching it, because that's really what's presented to us here. We're presented with no alternative. It's like we're going to make a mockery of all of these things and basically make it seem laughable that liberation is even possible, which is basically the takeaway from this movie. And that's just like ahistorical liberal trash, from my perspective. And no wonder you walk away feeling confused and like you're in a whirlpool. There's nothing empowering about that. Liberation empowers us, right? It empowers us. It makes us feel like we have a future. It gives us hope. You were using that term hope, Kiley. And this future was like the opposite. I mean, this movie was the opposite of that.
Yeah, there was what you said, Melanie, like there was this sort of subtext of the Telecon quest for um, or against colonization. You see that in the very beginning. And then you take this sharp turn to them attacking Wakanda. So it looks like what they're saying is that the only way to achieve um, a um, a future without colonization, without imperialism, the only way to protect the water and to protect their sovereignty is to attack another nation that is also struggling with the same things. And it just took this turn into um, basically ensuring that the brown and Black people were going to fight one another and not the true enemy, which is colonialism and imperialism and capitalism and destruction of our home planet. And so it was like, that's how we're going to distract you from the real issues, the real enemy, is by having Telecon fighting Wakanda. And we'll throw all these cute little CIA agents in there so that you won't be afraid of them and you won't think about the fact that the CIA is largely responsible for, one of the greatest Mayan nations, which is also called Guatemala, and the CIA was the one who created a coup and installed an American capitalist dictator, American sponsored capitalist dictator down there. And they really are the enemy. The CIA really is the enemy. It's not Bilbo Baggins and it's not Veep. It's real world struggles against the CIA, which is just the strong arm of US imperialism and US capitalism and US colonization. So I think that's why we all ended up so confused, because like we understand what the reality on the ground is, and what the reality on the ground bears no resemblance to what was shown on this film. And it just like, and I keep going back to what Kiley said, like the whirlpool. You feel like you're just being swirled around, and then at the end of the movie you just go down the drain and you're not quite sure where you end up.
Exactly. And I like that how you brought up, Melanie, that this is also a reflection of, you know, where we are politically, and just how people think of liberation and like indigenous nationhood. Oh gosh, because like one thing to so there are so I have so many blank spots for this movie, because there was just portions of it where, yeah, like I just disassociated, and yeah, I was just like, this is just too much being thrown at me at once. But so I'm sort of just speaking to what I remember and what stuck out to me the most. And so I was just thinking in the context of I can't pronounce their name, so I'm just gonna call them water people. The water nation. But yeah, so like we had discussed earlier, they had moved into the ocean to escape colonialism and like ensure their survival as a nation. So their like nation is underwater, and it's also found that they have like vibranium, and so they're protecting the ocean and their nation from resource extraction. And um the scene where I can't exactly remember what's going on or like what had just happened, but there's a scene where there's like a ship, um but it belongs to Wakanda, or it came from Wakanda. And so all of the water people are like surrounding the ship, and they're like they come up to the surface, and so they're like still in the water, but all you can see is like their shoulders and on up. And so it kind of shows that scene, and then like the camera pans out, and so you see all of the like airplanes and the helicopters like surrounding the water people, and they're just like dropping bombs, and they're using like sonar technology to like mess with their like cognition, or just to kind of like confuse them. But when I saw that scene, just like immediately, I thought of Standing Rock, and how the police and like how the police had positioned themselves on top of like this hill, and at the bottom of the hill, like literally the water protectors were standing in the river, like protecting their land and protecting the water. And I just could not like shake that like parallel because it was just so like just so what's the like I don't know, it's just so visceral, like it's just so in your face, like how can you not make that connection? And like we said earlier, it's just very intentional. So it kind of made me think of like, okay, like who else had their hands in making this movie? And there's no way that like they could not be aware of these movements. Like there's no way. Like and also too, just thinking about like how anti-Indianism is so prevalent in this country, and it sort of like works with liberalism, right? So like um I think to me it just seemed like another trope, or just like building upon um like tropes of indigenous people like historically in film, um where it's like our struggles, our identity, just like who we are as like Native people politically has always been for the taking. Whether it's like land or land, water, sovereignty, nationhood, even our own like quote unquote like representation, it's all for the taking. And so I feel like that's what this film was doing in terms of like our struggles and what we're up against and how we're defending ourselves from like these entities like the police or the military or just like the whole USA. Like and then so it was sort of just like consumed like in this movie and then like regurgitated into another trope and like another mockery for like entertainment. And I just oh gosh, it just makes me so upset. Like I hate it so much.
Yeah, I mean, to build off of what you were saying, you know, about Standing Rock, Kiley, and like the scene that the iconic, it wasn't a scene, it was something that actually happened on more than one occasion where the police were throwing tear gas and like water, you know, water protectors in the river when they were on top of the hill. That was the Cannonball River going into the Missouri River. And like I remember the scene the first time when it got really cold. I think that November up at camp, and the live scenes that were being streamed on Facebook by grassroots media people of all of those cops and like those militarized cops on top of the tanks. Do you remember this? Right at the line on the highway. I forgot what the highway was. That was very reminiscent. Well, the Wakandan craft, the ship you're talking about was very like angular, right? It looked like a tank. It looked like a tank, but in water. And it was that scene was very reminiscent, I think, of the scene from Standing Rock that I remember, where there was that entire line of militarized cops and they were spraying people. They were spraying water protectors, even though it was like sub-zero. They took people's eyes out that night. They were shooting bullets at people, rubber bullets. I think that was the night that that water protector lost her eye to a bullet. People were bleeding. Several people went into cardiac arrest that night at Standing Rock. And that is what that scene reminded me of. And I think the reason why I'm bringing that up is because I remember when Trump was elected in 2016, and do you remember like the show Handmaid's Tale came out that same year, the next year? Do you remember this? And Handmaid's Tale is basically about like a hyper conservative revolution that happens in the United States, and then it becomes, I forget what the republic is called, but it's based on like misogyny and like really profound violence against women, like an authoritarianism that is premised on misogyny. And I remember when I watched the first season of that show was the first year of Trump's presidency. And I was like, I was traumatized out watching that show as a woman, because I was like, oh my God, this is actually happening right now. And I'm sure that they timed it in that way to kind of like reflect the political reality of that particular moment. The reason why I'm saying this is because I feel like the Wakanda Forever also came out. You were talking about the week that it came out, but it's coming out in a particular political moment where I felt super traumatized out by the movie, because like what the movie was portraying is actually happening in real time. And there are references in the movie, like the scenes from Standing Rock, you know, that happens like when Wakanda, you know, is battling and brutalizing the indigenous water nation. Those things are actually plucked from reality, the reality in like the struggles that we have been participating in the last like five to 10 years. And so it's not just a movie, right? It's not just a Marvel movie. It's a movie that is very intentionally like commenting on the present and representing and presenting itself as something that very much belongs to our present political condition in our present political moment. And so that's why the movie felt really real to me. And maybe that's why my expectation was a little bit different with this film too, because it seems very intentional that it is plucking right, these moments out of the reality of liberation front lines. But then, like you said, what it does with it through like the politics of representation, it distorts it and regurgitates it as this trash, this liberal trash. And then, you know, like, and then where the movie leaves you is so, I think a lot of people are in that place. I think liberals are in that place. Like people who are really obsessed with like politics online are probably in this place of infighting, because I see it happen all the time, especially between like black political communities and indigenous political communities. But that is not where everyone is at. The people who are on front lines and people who are doing work on the ground and in other spaces do not live their lives online. And like this realm of I don't know, like this counter revolutionary kind of pessimistic realm where it's like we're never going to have a future because we're just fighting with each other all the time. That does exist in a particular realm at the moment, but that certainly isn't like, that doesn't define like how everyone kind of feels or is approaching things. And so it's like the movie is like it's a fictional account, but it also has like a very real impact and a real negative impact, I would say, on like what our political possibilities are for movement building in this particular moment. And that is what's really dangerous about this movie. And the fact that so many people have seen it.
Yeah, I think back to this commercial that I saw. You know, we're getting all of the holiday commercials, and there was a commercial, and I don't even know what it was for, but it was a little girl dressed up um, like a Wakandan, and they had the store that she was shopping at with her mother. They had the beads, and she wanted the beads. I think it was a credit card commercial, and so she was able to get these. She was able to consume these beads as part of American consumer culture, and she was able to have them. So she was able to buy this token um, of this film, and it was just really disturbing because I just wonder why people think that the characters portrayed in this movie are suitable um, to be idolized by children. And I haven't read too much. I actually went into this movie not really understanding that there was going to be an indigenous representation. Like I hadn't read anything about it. I was just kind of looking like Kiley. I go to movies sort of as an escape to stop thinking for a couple of hours. And I was really excited just to see, because I always thought Shuri was kind of a cool character and she was fun and she was hip, you know, and she was a tough chick and like, you know, super cool. And I thought it was just going to be an enjoyable 2 hours. And so as I started watching it and got, you know, such horrible, horrible um, messaging coming from this film. Um, and then after I rested my mind for a couple of days, I started reading some of the online comments about it, and a lot of really positive comments about representation. And to me, that was really horrifying because I don't think there was any positive representation of anyone in this film. And there is a lot of identity politics around the indigenous characters. Like, really, who are they? What are they? Where do they come from? Are they Mayan? Are they Aztec? Are they like people we've never heard of with winged feet and, you know, pointy ears? Is it Satan? Is it like a representation of the of the Christian Satan? Um, and like I don't know what they were aiming for, but whatever the writers were aiming for, they didn't get anything right, and they certainly didn't represent Chicano, Latino, Latinx, Mayan, global South indigenous nations well at all. They were not. They were the enemy. they were, represented as the enemy, although, they were water protectors. But they were aggressively belligerent. Melanie used that word too, and I remember that word coming to my mind. They like, why did they go after Wakanda in the first place in a belligerent manner, and not just say, "Hey, we have a common enemy. Like, let's get together and fight." Like, there was never any of that. It wasn't like they approached Wakanda and Wakanda said, "No, we're isolationist. We're not going to play ball with you." It was like literally they were belligerent from the very get-go. And so I didn't find anything positive or anything redeemable about any of the characters, from Namor to his sister to any of the water tribe. And then the Wakandans, like, really sort of fell apart. Like, their independence and their liberatory struggles were non-existent. They were all consumed with this individuality. Like with Shuri, it was, I have to um to take this medicine so that I can become the Black Panther, and um take my place, take my brother's place, take my place. And yet it's all about her traumas and about her getting to that place. And when she sees Killmonger instead of who she wanted to see, it's like she's disappointed that this is who the ancestors sent her. Get over yourself. Like, you need to protect your community and your people. And there was no, and Kiley, you said this too, there was like no redemption arc for any of the characters. They were just all bad. And so I can't imagine, like, you've got a child and they want to, they want to dress up as Shuri. What are you telling your child? Like, what values are you elevating for your child that you want this to be their idol? I didn't get it. And I have to say, a lot of, at least the indigenous people that I read, who were praising this movie for the representation, they were all men. And so dudes really seem to like the winged feet and the pointy ears. I'm not quite sure why, but I wonder what that means.
This is peak representation, politics of representation, or like recognition. This is the logical conclusion of a liberal politics of recognition, where it's like you're just putting like Black women into these characters, and it's kind of like these characters are just receptacles for representation or tokenization, essentially, or like you're including indigenous nationhood. And because what liberal identity politics does is it creates the liberal individual, which is one of the building blocks. Sorry, I'm going to go into my academic explanation. But like the liberal individual, which is one of the building blocks of like liberal societies like the United States, for example. And then the logic of race, which creates a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy of value that's assigned, where some people, some human beings, but then also certain forms of life, right? Whether they're animals or plants or the earth itself, are given value according to their class, right? There's a class hierarchy that's built into liberal ideology. And then the liberal individual becomes this kind of like measuring mechanism for like, it's the receptacle. It's essentially, what would they call it in post-structuralism? It's like an empty signifier. It's a receptacle that you can invest with certain attributes to do the work of this like class and racial hierarchy. And so today, I've talked about this in relationship to the pretendianism stuff, right? Today, because we live in a neoliberal multicultural society where liberalism has taken on this like gesture of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Where the gesture of inclusion means you get to include people, a tokenized few people, into like a hall of power, whether it's like a powerful political position or you're giving them more money to make movies like this or Reservation Dogs, or those kinds of things. And so the gesture of inclusion means that you're giving somebody resources for their identity, right? And so the liberal individual receptacle under a neoliberal multicultural order is one in which like more diversity and like more inclusion of more diverse identities becomes like the commodity. It becomes the way in which like liberalism re-expresses itself and regurgitates itself, right? To renormalize itself when it's being challenged for its racism, right? When it's being challenged for the prior kind of iterations of like the receptacle of liberal individualism that has usually and still today pretty much just been invested with like heteropatriarchy and white supremacy and like a property bearing, like the property bearing white settler male, for example, in a place like the United States. And so it's tricky because it can be invested with different identity attributes, but it's still just at the end of the day, the empty signifier. Jody Bird calls it the zombie imperialism. It's still just a zombie, no matter what kind of character, the color of their skin, the language that they're speaking that you put into the zombie, it's still just a zombie. And so the movie is literally just filled with a bunch of zombies. It's like identity is it's like purely tokenized because if it weren't just a zombie, then there would be actual politics to the movie that wasn't just liberalism. It wasn't just the dead end of liberalism. Because like I said, that like zombie receptacle, it'll just keep reinventing itself over and over and over again to smooth over any kind of challenge to like the original class hierarchy that drives the entire system of liberalism that liberalism relies upon. And so I think we've already done a pretty good job, I think, kind of pointing out and analyzing that the movie doesn't actually have politics. It's like the anti-politics. It's like anti-liberation. And so the only conclusion that I can draw is that it's just pure liberal individualism, which is also why the plot of the film is very incoherent as well, because it's basically just a bunch of individuals, whether or not they're like Black women, who are trying to lead Wakanda, or they're like an indigenous man who's trying to lead, the indigenous water nation. They're literally just individuals who are being motivated by their individual traumas, right? Their grief, their revenge, or whatever. And then they just like fight with each other. And then like nothing gets resolved. There's no politics whatsoever. It's literally just like individual motivations. And it's just a bunch of individuals, I don't know, just like running amok, just making really poor choices, basically. And then there's no explanation about like what motivates them other than their individualism. And so that's why I think that this is like peak liberalism. I know it represents where a lot of people are at. I know I have this analysis because I watch how people act online. A lot of this shit happens and unfolds online. There's a reason why pretendianism is a thing, because I think pretendianism very much participates in this liberal identity politics, the zombie imperialism, that I was talking about. But this film definitely does that too. And that's not politics. Liberalism is the political ideology that made like capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism possible in the 17th century. And like, we need to abolish that shit. And we need to get out of whatever world that creates for us, because it makes us think that this is like the path, or like somehow this is all that's possible. That's what liberalism does. It makes us, like you said, it's a container, Kiley. You felt contained. Like it literally like imprisons us in our own minds to think that our identities are the most important things. And like somehow if we like express our identities more, or we get more inclusion, or we put on our power suit or like the Black Panther suit and we like act like a man as a woman, like somehow that's going to liberate us. That is not what liberation means. Liberalism and liberation have the same root term, lib, but they do not mean the same thing. And I'm so fucking sick of liberalism, because it destroys everything in the United States. And Americans are so like unaware, like they're like militantly, like purposefully unaware of like how liberal their politics are. And then they export it to the rest of the world. That's the other thing. I'm sorry, I'm just going off and I'm just so pissed off. Like, that's the other thing that really pisses me off about this movie, is that it takes this like the liberal unconscious of American racial politics, really, that's what it does. And then it like imposes that on the global South. Wakanda's in Africa. Like the water nation is in like Latin America, right? These are nations that have been trying to liberate themselves from European and American imperialism for centuries. And you're going to take your like American exceptionalist bullshit, and then you're just going to export that, and then you're going to subject these like actual national liberation struggles, like actual revolutionary struggles, to this like stupid shit online, like the way people behave on Twitter. Like, what is wrong with you? That's just another type of imperialism. And like imperialism happens through sanctions, it can happen through the CIA, it certainly happens through culture. And what is more effective in spreading this imperialist agenda that you're talking about, Kiley, than like through popular culture, through movies, through the Marvel universe, right? And then you're just like renormalizing this nonsense everywhere. And you're also like you're silencing like the beautiful, really difficult struggles that people, Black people, and Indigenous people, and women, and like LGBTQ folks, and water protectors, and land defenders are like the struggles that they're actually waging in the global South. Because they're not out here tokenizing themselves and engaging in liberalism. They're rejecting it and they're building the alternative that's going to fucking save us all. The alternative is definitely not going to come out of the United States. I'm so sick of like the navel gazing and just like the conceit of US politics when it comes to like movements. And that's really what I feel that this movie does.
And it's and the one of the things that just I was just nauseous is that they chose the Maya for this in sort of indigenous representation, and the real struggles and the real success of the Mayan nations, the Zapatistas, and who actually have created communities that are sovereign and self-supporting and indigenous and strong and liberated. And then they just took that sort of generic Mayan image and threw them in the water and negated, and that seems to be the word of the day, this negated everything that they have achieved, and they have struggled for centuries in Guatemala, and yet still struggle and die and stand up to imperialism, stand up to U.S. imperialism in the global South. And the Mayan are literally all the way down, and from Mexico into Guatemala, Belize, and they have been fighting for liberation and against U.S. imperialism, and they have not given up. They have not stopped struggling, and they don't buy into any of the U.S. bullshit colonization. And that's who you choose to take and put in this god awful movie. I mean, it's just an insult. And so I started out saying this, but I think it was a little bit less aggressive. What the fuck? Like, I'm sorry, but you think that is an okay representation? What the hell? And I'm sorry, the dude who plays Namor, he's like, yeah, we need to have this represent. No, motherfucker, you do not need to be representing Mayan people, okay? You can represent other people, but you don't take indigenous nations and represent them in this way without even thinking, about what you're doing. It just, that was so unbelievably offensive to me.
Well, I got aggressive, so but that's really how I feel. Can I also be petty? But not really petty. So, one of the previews before this movie was the fucking Avatar movie, the new Avatar movie, which is also blue water people. And I was like, when I saw the indigenous nation Wakanda Forever, I was like, are you fucking kidding me? These are blue water people. This is literally just Avatar, but in the Marvel universe. I was like, are you kidding me? Instead of doing the racist thing where they like romanticize indigeneity like they do in Avatar and Wakanda Forever. Instead, they just do the racist thing where they like malign indigenous nationhood and like indigenous liberation, like anti-colonial liberation struggles. I was like, really? Did James Cameron help to write this movie? Because
So annoying. It's just so annoying. I hate it. God. Like, I am just so, like, I'm just done. I'm done with all of these like cartoonish I don't know, mockeries of the indigenous people or just even just struggles in general. Because okay, I know I this might be repetitive, but I just cannot let it go. Like, um, earlier I had mentioned how this movie places the audience like in a position where you're deciding which side to choose, which is essentially it's like, are you going to choose to be anti-Indian or anti-Black? And like, but then by placing you in that position, you do get distracted because you're forced to watch these two nations fight each other, and while the real enemy, the Americans, are in the background. And so like essentially you just become like pro-American, you become pro-imperialist, like unconsciously, and I it just it just further like confirms to me that this movie is intentional, the timing that it came out, and it's like it's almost as if it was released to suppress, um or to at least like in some way discourage people from resisting, or to feel like you can't speak out against this movie because again, if you do, then you're either like anti-Indian or anti-Black as an audience member. And so I think that's why a lot of people feel silenced or they feel uncomfortable giving any sort of criticism for this movie. And like, and it's just so interesting to me too, because like even just like where we are now, realistically, like in the United States, we are still in a very like the potential for revolution is there. We have people striking, there are like protests, people are more consciously aware of their material conditions and want better better conditions for themselves. They like we just want to live like healthy, dignified lives. And so I just think that the people who made this movie are like against those things. They're very comfortable with like the bourgeois class. They're very comfortable with the ruling class because um though like capitalism benefits them. And if they have to give that up, then being on an equal level with like workers or like the working class is like oppression to them. So I just like that's just something that I walked away from, or that I had like leaving this movie, then after like unpacking it and processing it, that's the conclusion I came up to. And I was like, okay, like this movie has like an agenda. And the people who made it had an agenda.
yeah, I mean, it's basically like Black and Indigenous, like royalty and gods. It's like people who are born into ruling class. It's not the aristocracy, essentially. If you have like you want to talk about class hierarchy and how race is just basically the classification of life according to a hierarchy, all of the people in this movie are like at the top of that hierarchy, right? like a god. They're all untouchable. They're all powerful. They're omnipotent and shit, you know. And who died this year? It's fucking Queen Elizabeth died this year. And if it's weird because it's like the Wakanda particularly, but the nationhood of the Water Nation and then also Wakanda, it's like hyper nationalism. It's like a hyper nationalism where it's like you're born into power. Like, wasn't the French Revolution like fought against that? I mean, like, I just don't understand like how you can like glorify this understanding. It just feels like it feels like an homage to Queen Elizabeth. In a way, is what this film feels like. But then it's just like populated by like BIPOC people essentially, and it's just so gross. It's like telling you that you should feel good because there's all of this representation of women of color, for example, and there's like a representation of indigenous people. But then what it's actually, the politics it's actually delivering is this kind of like pro-imperialist, kind of like pro-ruling class, just ickiness, right? It's just like, and then when they're left to their own devices, the BIPOC people, all they can do is fight with each other. And like, they don't actually have the capacity to, to rule themselves. The women certainly don't in this film. The only time that like Shuri really has any kind of coherent power is when she puts on the man suit, when she puts on her power suit, the Black Panther suit, you know? And she has to get yoded to do that. Anyway, why does everyone also get yoded all the time? Anyway, the commentary on ancestors is actually very interesting. That's actually something that's kind of interesting when it comes to the commentary on Black and Indigenous liberation. But other than that, like, this is just an epic failure. This movie's an epic failure. And we have to say that because I think you're right, Kylie. I think it's very intentional. Like what it's trying to do is trying to Trojan horse some fucking imperialist shit into people's lives and into their identity.
And heteropatriarchal shit.
And heteropatriarchal shit.
Yeah, talk about the misogyny in this movie and the reestablishment of primogeniture and of male supremacy in Wakanda. All of the women who you think are going to be in charge. Oh, and like the other thing that was when you said Queen Elizabeth, like that brought up another thought. I mean, it's all of Queen Elizabeth's little subjects, all fighting amongst themselves, and that's really fucked up. But the hierarchy and the class and the aristocracy. So who fights? So let's separate who fights in this film and who dies in this film. So who fights? Shuri, Okoye, the Queen Mother in Wakanda, and Namor. But who actually dies? It's the proles. You don't ever see the aristocracy die. They may fight each other, but the ones who are dying are the Water Nation warriors who are in the water, who are getting bombed, and the Wakandans in the streets. Not the aristocracy, not those living in the castle, but it's always the proles who are dying while the aristocracy is fighting amongst themselves. And then yes, Shuri puts on her man suit and she becomes this great hero, but we really can't allow that to continue. So at the very end of the movie, you have after the credits, post credits, you have this scene with the Lupita Nyong'o character's name I can't remember, who parades out this young boy and introduces him as Toussaint, which is the leader of the Haitian Revolution, and then she crushes that by saying, "Well, this is T'Challa." And so now you know that Shuri is good. Not that she was very effective to begin with; she was too in her traumas. But now you realize that she's going to be replaced by T'Challa the second. And so we have reestablished the heteropatriarchy, and it's a good thing because we can't possibly continue with this aristocracy, with this hierarchy, unless we also reestablish heteropatriarchy. And the idea of, things consistently being passed down to men. It's just,
basically like representation, identity, and injury politics does not equate to revolutionary politics, or like it doesn't equal, it doesn't mean, that someone or something has like good politics. Is basically what I'm coming to realize.
Yep. Been saying it, gonna keep saying it. That's just, God damn it. Like, knock it off. We do not need to be investing almost $2 billion in this version. It's just like this liberal fantasy. And it's not even a fantasy because it like affects real life. And what it also does, and something I've noticed because of the way people talk about the relationship between like Black political formation and Indigenous political formation in the U.S. context, is very much in line with what you articulated, Kiley, where it's like the movie tells you as an audience member that you have to pick a side. And so if you're going to be pro-Indigenous liberation, then that automatically means that you're anti-Black. And then if you're going to be pro-Black liberation, then that automatically means that you're anti-Indian. And I actually see this play out constantly in the way people talk about Black and Indigenous relationality online in the US context. And it's maddening to me because you're basically saying that, what is it, like two wrongs make a right or something, or like it's like a double negation. And I'm like, isn't the point of liberation like about solidarity? Isn't it about affirmation? Like, why can't you be like pro-Black Indigenous liberation and pro-Indigenous liberation, or like at the same time? Because there's plenty of examples in history where that's been the case. I guess there's plenty of examples where that hasn't been the case, right? There is pervasive anti-Blackness in like Navajo nationalism, for example. This is something that's, real. And Kiley and I are both citizens of the Navajo Nation. We know this, and we need to continue to push back against it. That said, I feel like we're in this moment, and I feel like radical Black and Indigenous feminists are the people I look to, and like the political pillars of both Black and Indigenous struggle, at least in the United States today, that really give us like the best possibility for moving forward and dislodging ourselves from this like weird like space of double negation that we're constantly dragged into, or it's like liberation is impossible, or that somehow we can't get past our traumas and like the suffering that we have that we have endured under colonialism or white supremacy, that somehow we can't put that aside to like come together to form a really powerful revolutionary struggle together. And like the reason why I said that this is a mockery of Black feminism, it's also a mockery of Indigenous feminism, is because radical Black feminism is not only the most militant, it's like the tip of the spear right now, from what I can tell, with like Black liberation, at least in like the post George Floyd kind of 2020 context in the United States. But it has always long been about intersectionality and about solidarity and about the accountability that solidarity and that type of relationality requires. And then Indigenous feminism is certainly, I think, has very similar kind of themes or threads to it. And this is why like we actually talk as the Red Nation that like radical left Black feminism and radical left Indigenous feminism are the tip of the spear, really. Like that's our greatest hope. And like this movie was obviously written by a bunch of dudes. And like, there's a reason why dudes really like the representation. Heteropatriarchy is a dead end. Liberalism is a dead end. But I really think that like anti-colonial and anti-racist feminism is the path forward. And like, what would the relationship between Wakanda and I keep forgetting the name, Talakan, look like if it were like a feminist, like a radical feminist like version of what that relationship looks like? Man, they would have destroyed the United States. And that movie was long. They had like 3 hours to have some sort of good conclusion or some sort of resolution. Like, man, wouldn't that be amazing to watch a movie where people came together and just like took down the military? Or something like that. Could easily have spent $250 million on that kind of message. Wouldn't that be empowering and like awesome?
Yeah, I would have loved to see that. Especially they had that great fight on the bridge in Boston, the bridge that connects Cambridge from Boston, and that would have been a really great place to start with the destruction of the United States. Let's start where the United States started. Let's take out Boston first, and then let's just, keep going. That would have been a satisfying end to that movie. The Wakandans and the Telecons together, making imperialism their common enemy, and colonization and capitalism, and maybe we can come up with $250 million to film that movie.
Yeah, that seriously doesn't reflect what's happening on the ground at all. Many the most progressive, I'm not saying progressive in terms of like politics, I mean progressive as in like changing history, like really truly making strides in changing the material conditions for like oppressed people and nations are Black women and Indigenous women. That's the goddamn truth. And like this film is like doesn't represent that at all, even though it cherry picks from our struggles and then just distorts it and does this disgusting liberal thing with it. I'm I'm really sick of it. I'm really sick of it. It's far worse, I think, in the United States than it is in other places. I've said this before. So, man, if I weren't indigenous to the U.S., I would leave. Not indigenous to the US, but indigenous to the lands, that the US occupies and committed to liberating those lands.
I have no more words. I'm just like, it's so disgusting. But I mean, now that we're talking about it and sort of sucking out all the venom, I I don't, yeah, I just don't believe it for a second. Like, I just like full heartedly reject like every single, um, every single like, I don't know, message that this movie tried to put across. Cause like, it's just so like, what an insult to like, to the proles or like, the working class or just oppressed peoples in general who watched this movie. Like, what an insult to our intelligence. Like, you didn't think we would catch these things? You know what I mean? Like, but yeah, so I just don't believe it. It's whatever.
Yeah, it kind of feels elitist, actually. The movie feels pretty, well, of course, it's all about like gods and monarchy. Like, the movie feels very elitist. It has like a certain class commitment to it, for sure, that you named earlier, which also doesn't reflect reality. Like, the strike that's happening in the University of California right now, 48,000 workers are on strike in the largest university in the world. It's the largest labor action of 2022. You had Amazon workers heroically forming a union right earlier this year against like the most powerful corporation like ever to exist or whatever, right? And so honestly, I never thought when we started the Red Nation almost a decade ago that the labor struggle would somehow come back with like a vengeance, and become a really important element of the larger movement. I'd always heard these kind of like old school socialists, usually white folks, or like labor historians. I did not know what that was when I started graduate school. I was like, why is everyone constantly talking about labor history? And now I understand, because the labor struggle used to be something really powerful, right? At a certain moment, like earlier on in the 20th century. And now there's a labor struggle that's coming back, partly because of the pandemic, but like workers, the proles of the United States, are really shutting shit down. Remember the wildcat strikes, the teachers in like the Appalachian region of the US a few years ago? Like, I bet you all those people go to see Marvel movies because, I don't know, it's probably like a lot of proles, honestly, who go to see Marvel movies because like you just want to escape. You just want to like have some action, have a little bit of gratification, and it only costs you 15, $20, which you can afford if you're working on a pro salary. But again, like the class politics of the movie, it's class politics, it's gender politics, it's politics on capitalism and colonialism and imperialism, it's racial politics. It's just bad. It doesn't reflect where people are actually at, like at all.
Yeah. And like I know there's probably somebody out there who's like it's just a movie, but like but I think like media, it does play a role in like propaganda, whether it's like propaganda from the ruling class or like propaganda from like the working class. It has a role. There's like an intention behind it. And I just think it's also important for like oppressed peoples to see, or at least like like process how they're being represented in media, like movies, the news, um, like music, all of those things. It all impacts like how oppressed people's like view themselves, but also how they are like presenting themselves to people like outside of their nations or like outside of their culture. And and I guess that's why this movie just like angers me so much, because I'm like, seriously? Like, if you're going to be turning, water protectors or like land defenders and like twisting it into some kind of, I don't know, just some kind of like trope, or it's just like making our trauma something that should be like entertaining. I have an issue with that. I have a problem with that, because now it's like, okay, like here's another layer of like racism, or yeah, like racism, or like a stereotype I'm gonna have to encounter in the world. And it just, I am so sick of it. And it's also too like, and just thinking about like how, I mean, I'm not an organizer, but I'm a part of like an organization, and I am with like comrades who like organize within their communities. I have been and like supported like my comrades in protest and rallies, and it's just so like, it's just so insulting, because then even if you do take representation as like a positive, or like from this movie you take it as a positive, it's also like how many people are then going to come to like our events or our protest or rallies and think that somehow we're empowered by like having like our water protectors and land defenders like represented in this movie, when actually they're being like brutalized, and it was like for entertainment. And it's just like a whole thing. I don't know, maybe that's just me like over analyzing or whatever, but it's like I know it's gonna happen. Like I know someone is gonna come and just like reference this movie, or like just completely unaware of the fact that like we still have water protectors and land defenders like in prison. They're like incarcerated, and there's also like water protectors and land defenders that are facing like federal charges, that are surveillanced by the state. And it's, I don't know, yeah, it's just so upsetting to me. And I just like, I can't, yeah, I don't know, I guess I'll end there. But it's just like another thing, I guess, that we have to, I don't know if we would like necessarily have to like tackle it, but it's just another layer. It's another block. Block in the wall that we have to tear down. And it's like, so it's just so exhausting. Like, please stop. stop with these stereotypes, or like just stop. Just stop.
Well, and I think when Melanie said that, how much did this movie make? Something over, right. So that's really not just a movie. That's like a blockbuster that everyone is seeing, and with those stereotypes and with those tropes and with all of the trauma that is being consumed by the world. It's not just an American thing. I mean, these movies go all over the world. So this is how they're consuming indigenous culture. This is how they're consuming Black culture and revolutionary struggle and futurism or not futurism. So it is important. It is important to take these things apart and analyze them and actually tell the truth, because Wakanda Forever was one story written by, I think, a couple of really shit ass dudes. But what we're doing right now is we are reclaiming the narrative, and we are repurposing it, and we are retelling it as our story. And starting with how we felt when we saw that movie and what it did to us, and what, with a few weeks, in the rearview mirror, how we're taking it apart is our story, and our story is relevant and it's important, and we have to be able to answer to these things, because these things are being fed to people on a global level. But if we're not able to speak our own truth and tell our own story, then that's what they're going to get away with. They're going to get away with selling this to the masses. So I think what we do when we do these things is really important. We might not have the reach of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but at least we're telling our story, and at least we're telling our truth, which I think is important.
I mean, this is, after all, a podcast. We are all, after all, involved in red media, which is like indigenous media, right? By and for indigenous people. And like the reason why we created red media to help cultivate movements for liberation is because of media like this, right? That feeds you nonsense. And it's important, was it Fidel Castro was talking about the war of ideas, right? The realm of cultural reproduction. It's an important site and field of struggle. It's as important as any other front line. So we're on a front line here, when we're contesting and pushing back and refusing, we're engaging in a politics of refusal, which is a kind of a mainstay of indigenous nationhood, historically in Turtle Island. And, the people who worked on getting the Washington football team name, that mascot changed, right? Like More Than a Word, which is a great documentary that came out in 2018. Every single Native person interviewed in that documentary is like, representation and like stereotypes don't just exist in a vacuum. They have material consequences. This has always been the argument, right, of the folks who've been doing really good work on trying to retire racist mascots. And it's because if you're a caricature, then you're not human, right? And when Native people are represented as dehumanized, then of course, like, we're not going to be seen as having the capacity to govern ourselves or to steward the land. We're not even seen as human beings, right? We're seen as subhuman. And the same thing goes for like our Black relatives too, and the way they've historically been represented. And just because you put some indigenous people and some Black people in roles, I don't know, where like they do have full humanity, the message at the end of the day is still one in which like all we're capable of is fighting each other, and like we're not really capable of being like fully governing, vibrant, beautiful, strong people who have a future, and that future is together, right? In the Red Deal, we say like the world of like indigenous liberation is a world in which many worlds fit. That's like a plurinationalist understanding of nationhood. And I mean, we're going to stick to our guns that is, that is the path forward. It is a world in which many worlds fit, and that world is a world filled with cooperation. It's a world filled with internationalism, and it's a world filled with solidarity. And actually, we need those things if we're going to survive. I think the climate catastrophe that confronts us as a species, not just as indigenous nations. So yeah, this kind of stuff matters. And I don't know, indigenous people, we just don't tolerate this shit. Like, at least the Red Nation definitely doesn't tolerate this shit. Like, you can't silence us with your liberal nonsense. We are not going to fall for that. Like, not going to fall for that shit. You just can't be openly racist against Native people anymore. Stop doing it. That's the other thing. Enough. We talked about this during our last episode. Like the ICWA case. Like, let's just be openly racist and stupid and like incredibly ignorant about indigenous people and indigenous nations. Seriously? And no, stop. Like you said, Kiley, stop. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I don't know what to say either. Well, I think that was beautiful, though, the way that you summed it up, Melanie. Just that, just stop. Our movements are a braid. We'll never be torn apart.
Oh, our movements are a braid. We'll never be torn apart. That is the title of this episode. Aw. Well, Elena, do you have any closing thoughts?
I think that's beautiful. Just stop and remember, we're watching, we're listening, we're seeing you, and you're not going to get away with this shit.
Apparently, RPH has just become like the watchdog.
The aunties are watching.
The aunties are watching, and we will not be silenced.
Not be silenced.
No, not to scare anyone. That's why, but
No, you should be scared. You really should. Because we know where you live, shit asses.
Yeah, a lot of shit assery going on. Shit attitude.
Sterling, I hope you're listening, because those are your words for the next season: shit assery and shit.
Shit attitude.
Shit attitude.
Well, thanks for joining, everyone. I'm interested in hearing other reviews from all different kinds of people of this movie. Maybe it has also taken other folks a while to kind of like digest what was really going on in this movie, because it's just kind of like it's like an everything everywhere all at once kind of an experience. It's kind of an overload. So definitely interested in hearing what others have to say. But just a reminder, if you're interested in more content like this, we've been recording for 1 hour and 45 minutes. So some of this is going to be for patrons only. Okay. We're going to figure out. And if you want access, that's my cat. I'm so sorry. If you need access, if you want access to part of this episode, then you're going to have to join our Patreon. You can do it at $1 a month, preferably more, because we pretty much fund everything that we do here. And a lot of us do this work for free. Like Elena wants to take a nap right now, and instead we've been talking about this movie. And honestly, I don't think any of us really had the time to invest all of our feelings and our analysis into something that could have been way better. Honestly, didn't have to be perfect, but it could have definitely not been this. And we all spent a lot of money watching this movie. Between us, we probably spent about $60 to $70 on popcorn and tickets. And like, I want my money back. And also, like, it's frustrating to have to constantly do this kind of work in addition to like the actual work that we do and all of the other stuff on our plates. So that's my kitty. She's now at the door. I'm going to sign off because she's going to start bellowing. See you all back in a couple of weeks. We're going to do a year in review. We're going to pick our favorite episodes of 2022, and then we're going to talk about the stuff. I think we're going to do an Ask Me Anything, Ask Us Anything episode again. So please look forward to that, everyone. Thanks.